everybody. If you have questions when you go along that are pressing and you think they're relevant, I will try to keep an eye on that little chat box. If you want to type something in there, and I'll try to notice it, and I could respond to questions that way as we go along if there's anything urgent. Glad to have everybody out there. I have really a slide set from some breaking research that we've just completed. In fact, this research was done by Rob Rowbotham as part of his PhD work, and he really did 3 studies. And today I have all of the slides from the 3 studies in this PowerPoint, but I've turned off all but one of the studies. If we get through the survey...
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Sorry.
Okay, did it just start?
Yeah, well, no, I've been recording. It's just I clicked another button, so.
Okay. All right. So if we get through this survey data, we'll take a few questions on that, and then if we have a little more time, I may go through the 2 experiments that we did up at Marshfield as well. But today I'm going to be talking about the impact of bedding choice on udder health of freestall herds here in Wisconsin. These are really larger freestall herds. And again, this research was defended yesterday in a PhD successfully. And the paper that I'm going to be talking about, the research I'm going to be talking about now, was conducted on Wisconsin dairy farms in many of your counties. And this paper has been published in the Journal of Dairy Science, and if anyone would like a copy of it, I can send that out. It's getting a lot of attention recently. Hordes excerpted part of it. I'm getting questions as it kind of trickles out into the industry, so I thought this would be really relevant information to get out into our counties. So when we think about what's happened in the Wisconsin dairy industry, one of the things that has a really big change in the last 10 to 15 years is this restructuring that we've had going on of the dairies and our milk production. And today, a very small proportion of the herds, and I'll show you that data in a minute, are producing a very large percentage of the milk. And these larger herds, as they've modernized, they are using primarily freestall operations, and within those freestalls, they're using a variety of different bedding types. And so the purpose of the study I'm going to show you today was to do a survey of the bedding practices of larger Wisconsin dairy farms and look at associations between management practices of bedding and some general management practices as well, and some indicators of udder health. So this study was conducted between May 2010 and April 2012. And we had only one selection criteria for herds to be eligible to participate in this study, and that selection criteria was that the farms had to ship at least half of a tanker load per day. And a half of a tanker load is approximately 25,000 pounds per day. That translates to a dairy of approximately 200 to 250 cows. So that's just about the minimum herd size given average levels of production that would be eligible to be in this study. Let me show you the demographics of how that broke out as of May 1st, 2012. So as of that date, on the Wisconsin licensed dairy herd list, there were 12,770 dairies. Now we're down to about 10,000. When we put in our selection criteria of at least half a tanker load of milk, that made 12,383 of Wisconsin dairy herds ineligible, meaning that on that list of 12,770 licensed dairy herds at that time, there were only 387 which shipped at least half a tanker load of milk. By the way, that group of herds produces more than half of the milk currently in Wisconsin, is my understanding. Just for some frame of context, I received some information in the last few days that we're down to about 10,000 dairy farms, but this number of herds that would be eligible today is over 400 dairy herds. So this, while the overall number of Wisconsin licensed dairy herds has dropped since we enrolled for this study in 2010, the actual number of potential study participants, if we were going to do this study again, has actually gone up fairly considerably. I believe it's about 420 now. So these potential study participants, these 387 herds, all received a postcard, and that postcard didn't say in this instance, would you like to participate in the study? We're going to call and try to arrange a visit. What the postcard said was, hey, somebody's going to stop by your farm, and we hope you'll participate in our questionnaire. So it's very different than the way we usually enroll, and because of that, we ended up actually enrolling, visiting, and conducting a survey on 325 out of the 387 farms, which was a total of 84% participation rate. So it's almost a census of this herd size population. So the survey was a relatively brief survey because we were just stopping by and trying to get people to participate. We kept the survey short. We wanted it to take no more than 15 to 20 minutes. So what we had is each of the enrolled farms were visited by one of 5 survey administrators. Now the survey administrators consisted of Rob Rowbotham, who was a PhD student, or Grande field reps who were trained on how to participate and administer a university survey. And when they went to the farms to do these surveys, they were representing the University of Wisconsin in this, and they had monthly training programs to keep them on track and keep them on the doing the survey according to the protocol. So Rob did most of the surveys, but a very considerable proportion were done by these field reps. They administered the 60-question survey. The survey instrument had both management practices and bedding types. And then after all the surveys were finished, we had, in the process of doing the surveys, we'd asked for a release to obtain the milk quality data from the processors. And so then we contacted all the processors of the farms that we had contacted and asked them to send us directly their somatic cell count and bacterial count data for the period of the study, which was May 1, 2010 to April 30th, 2012. So we had the survey data and we had actual bulk milk quality data, not just asking them what their milk quality was like. So when we put all that data together, we then categorized the farms by bedding type, and there were initially 2 big categories. One group of farms, and this is the group that I'll be showing you the data of today, had used the same type of bedding in all of the groups, in all of their pens, for the entire 2-year period that we were interested in. So, in fact, that was most of the farms. And those farms were categorized as either using inorganic bedding for that 2-year period, and I'll go into more details on what those bedding types are, manure-based bedding, which for the 2-year period, or other organic bedding. And that other organic bedding is primarily mattress farms that have wood products on the top. So that was the biggest group. The biggest group actually used the same bedding type for the entire 2-year period. But we had some herds that used different bedding in different pens, or different bedding during the study period. They may have changed bedding. And for those herds, we'll present some of the characteristics of how they manage the farm, but the herds that use different bedding types were not included in our analysis of associations of bedding type and milk quality. We then did some statistical analysis. We looked at the survey results for all of the herds by bedding type. We looked at the associations of management practices with cell count and with some other indicators of udder health. We looked at the associations of bedding type and management with rolling herd average and actually daily milk. And we looked at the associations of bedding type and bacterial count. So let's start off with the farm characteristics. So we ended up with, again, 325 herds. those 325 herds contained almost 300,000 milking cows. So there's a lot of cows in this relatively small number of herds. The herd size of those 325 cows ranged from about 255 at the minimum to 8,100 milking cows, not including the dry cows. This group of herds averaged about 81 pounds per cow per day. Interestingly enough, 82% of these herds were enrolled in DHIA with some frequency of individual cow somatic cell count testing, and amazing amount of compliance and adoption of many best management practices that we recommend. 99.7% post-dipped, greater than 99% pre-dipped, 92% dried teats. The herds in general that didn't dry teats were using teat scrubbers, so it was a different form of pre-milking prep, and 87% of these herds incorporated force stripping in their milking routine. So enormous adoption of best management practices in this group of herds. Now the graph that you see up on your right is the bedding that was used on the enrolled farms, and this is now grouped together by herds that we were analyzing. You can see the inorganic bedding was the most frequent type of bedding used by a long shot on these farms, and we had 195 farms that were using inorganic bedding. The most common type of inorganic bedding used by 120 of the 195 farms was simply fresh, clean sand. The second within most common inorganic bedding was actually recycled sand. And this kind of surprised me. I expected there to be more recycled sand relative to new sand, but you can see you have 120 herds using clean new sand and only 29, I think it was 28 herds that were using recycled sand. Really big difference. People really prefer the fresh, clean sand. And then within that inorganic group, we also had just a couple of herds that used either limestone or mixtures of limestone and sand. So that's the group that we'll be talking about when we go further into this presentation, talking about inorganic. It's primarily clean sand, but there is some recycled sand. The organic non-manure, which is that group that's got 62 herds in it, you'll see the green bar sticking up there where it says sawdust and shavings. We had 35, 38 herds that had mattresses with wood products on the top. That was simply the most common type of bedding that fell into this group. And there were a couple other types of bedding in there, either different products on top of mattresses, or I think there were 1 or 2 herds in there that had some sort of deep bedded non-manure organic based bedding. And then finally we had manure based bedding, and manure based bedding was primarily digester solids, and then we also had some other types of manure based bedding, including I think there were 2 herds that used what they called green bedding, simply wet manure. All right, let's look at the overall management practices that are used on these large herds in Wisconsin. As I mentioned earlier, these herds have tremendous adoption of recommended best management practices, and that's shown here in this graph. The vertical axis on this graph shows the percent of farms that are utilizing each practice, and we've written those percentages on. And then we just presented here a number of best management practices. And so for example, always pre-dipping, 99% of the herds do that. Use a dipper, foamer, or scrubber, so that would be the way that they do it, 88%. The contrast to that would be a sprayer. 92% always dry teats, 87% always force drip. Virtually every herd always post dips. I think there was 1 herd in the entire data set that didn't always post dip. 81% had a complete milking routine. Complete milking routine means they force strip, pre-dip, dry, attach, and post-dip. 82% utilized DHIA testing, usually on a monthly basis, and 74% had a written milking routine. So just tremendous adoption of many of these practices. Very different than when we go out and survey smaller herds. And so this is one of the gaps that we have within our industry here in Wisconsin. It's just these big herds are adopting practices at a much greater rate, which widens the gap between them relative to productivity. I'm not going to spend much time on bacterial count on these herds because there's not much interesting to talk about here. When we received the processor data for that 2-year period, we had 72,533 counts. From those 72,533, we had to figure out how to analyze that. And to do that, we randomly selected 1 count per farm per month for analysis. We tried to look at some associations with total bacterial count with bedding type, but really total bacterial count wasn't associated with bedding type because this population of farms simply has outstanding bacterial count uniformly. And we looked at the farms and their data. We had 100% compliance with the PMO regulations, and we had 100% compliance with European Union regulations. The chart that is on your right shows the percent of counts below the various thresholds. For bacterial count, the upper threshold is 100,000 CFU per ml, and you can see that almost all of the counts were under 100,000, so almost 100%. If you look at 25,000, which is kind of a threshold that processors use to go and do troubleshooting on farms, you can see that about 94% of the farms of the counts were under 25,000. And when we look at 10,000, which is kind of uniformly defining very high quality milk, you see about 85% of all the counts were below that threshold. So the microbial quality of bulk milk from these large Wisconsin dairy farms is simply outstanding. It's not related to bedding type, and it really isn't an area that we have to have a lot of concern. And this is probably a direct consequence of 2 things. One is many of these large farms have relatively recently modified facilities, at least the milk plant part of it, and they have very high adoption of pre-milking preparation procedures that translate into high microbial quality milk. Plus they're shipping milk on close to a daily basis, and therefore there's not a lot of on-farm storage that we have to worry about. So no more about bacterial count because it's simply not interesting in this population. Now let's take a look a little bit more at the characteristics of these farms by bedding type. And here I'm showing just the herds that have a single type of bedding, not the herds that changed bedding types across our survey period. So here we've got the farms in this table divided into inorganic herds. There's inorganic bedding. That's 195 herds. The organic non-manure, which basically have mattresses, and then the manure-based herds. So there's 29 manure-based herds. The values in red on this chart are statistically different from the values in black within a row. So if you look at the number of cows based on bedding type, you can see that herds that have manure-based bedding are approximately twice as large. They're milking approximately twice as many cows, 1,500 cows, versus somewhere between 700 and 850 cows. So we've got larger farms that are using these manure-based systems. When we look at milk per cow per day, and I'll show you data on rolling herd average that goes with this in just a minute, this was some of the initial data we looked at, and while we expected some differences, we didn't expect the magnitude of the differences that we saw here. Herds that use basically sand, inorganic bedding, produce a heck of a lot more milk per cow per day, 83.1 pounds per cow per day, in contrast to herds that use other bedding types. Now the organic non-manure herds were producing 76.2. The manure-based herds were producing 78.1. Those weren't different from each other, but the herds on sand simply are producing a lot more milk. Keep that in mind when I show you a couple of the income calculations that we've done later. This large of a difference in milk production really translates into a very large difference in gross income that you can't overcome really by any other indicator. So this is really driving the income on many of these sand-based farms. Now we've got 3 indicators of udder health that we've measured. And on our modern freestall operations here in Wisconsin, it's really important that we look at all three of these, not just at the bulk tank somatic cell count. So the first one we looked at is the bulk tank cell count. Bulk tank cell count, of course, measures the number of somatic cells in the milk that goes into the bulk tank. So it's one measure of udder health on a dairy farm, and it's a measure of subclinical mastitis. And what you'll see is that the herds that had sand, these inorganic herds, had a significantly lower bulk tank somatic cell count as compared to the herds that had either the organic non-manure, the mattress herds, or the manure-based herds. And if, while those two aren't statistically different, the 220 from the 248, you'll see that if you just contrast the number, the numerical difference, you've got about a 50,000 cell count advantage on the inorganic herds. Now, that's important both for premiums, but it's also really important because those differences are because you have a difference in the prevalence of the number of subclinically infected quarters, and that translates into lesser ability to produce milk, and that probably translates into some of the differences in the milk per cow per day that we observed. So that's one indicator of udder health, but it only measures really the subclinical mastitis. So we have a couple other indicators we also are starting to measure on large herds, and one of those is the percent of the cows on a daily basis that are being milked, but their milk is being discarded. So these are normally under treatment or they're in treatment pens, and the most common reason by a long shot that animals are treated on farms with a drug that requires a withholding is because of mastitis. And what you'll see on this is that the inorganic herds, the sand-based herds, on average had about 1.6% of the cows with milk discarded, which was statistically significantly different than the manure-based herds, which are running 2.4%. That 2.4 versus 1.6, that almost 1% difference is a pretty significant difference when you look at the amount of milk that's actually being discarded on a farm. And this milk is really expensive because you're feeding these cows, you're milking these cows, you're spending money on these cows, but you're not making any money on the cows. So that significant difference was something that's pretty dramatic. And then finally, the third thing we measure to assess udder health is a measure of chronicity and severity of mastitis. And what we see on many larger farms, especially as you see in this data on the manure-based farms, is in order to maintain that low bulk tank somatic cell count and in order to stop treating cows, people simply take chronically affected quarters out of production. And so we've been measuring that for several years on various farms, and what you'll see is that, there's an advantage to the sand-based herds. On the sand-based herds, about 4.5% of the cows were milking on less than 4 quarters, which was similar to the mattress-based herds, but on the manure-based herds, you're at 6.3%. That's almost reached statistical significance at p equals 0.055. From a practical standpoint, those numbers are considerably different with the manure-based herds, basically more chronic mastitis, more milk not sold, and a higher bulk tank somatic cell count. So you've got more subclinical mastitis, more clinical mastitis, and more chronic or severe mastitis on these herds. And that translates into a considerable difference in rolling herd average based on the bedding type used on these farms. Now this graph is in kilos. If you want to just double that to turn that into pounds, you're approximately right. But we found a statistically significant difference in rolling herd average based on the type of bedding that was used on a farm. And the advantage again was to the sand-based farms. The sand-based farms had approximately a 2,500 pound greater rolling herd average as compared to the manure-based farms, and the manure-based farms and the mattress herds were equivalent. Now, if we use the average milk price that farms were being paid during the period that we studied these herds, it was about $18.52 a hundredweight. That translates into $461 per cow per lactation in advantage of milk income, gross milk income for the sand-based herds, which for the average farm enrolled in our study translates into $393,000 per year. So because the scale of these farms is so large, differences like this translate into a lot of money. And I'll tell you, we're working right now, sometime in the next couple of weeks, we're going to have a little economic assessment tool out there on my website, which people can plug in and compare the impact of various bedding types, especially if they're going to be making decisions on building a barn or renovating a barn. And we'll use the data from both this study, and then if people want to override this data and plug in their own numbers, they can do that as well. But we'll have a little tool out there very soon. We're working with Victor on that. Another very interesting thing is, remember, these manure-based herds had much higher proportion of cows with non-functioning quarters, so much higher proportion of three-quartered cows. And we looked at the relationship between the rolling herd average, which is shown on the vertical axis, and the percentage of cows that are three-quartered, which is shown on the horizontal axis. And what you'll see is that the rolling herd average decreases 125 pounds for each 1% increase in cows milking on 4 quarters. And so that doesn't sound like a lot, but remember, that's 125 pounds per cow for each 1% increase. There's a 2% difference, so that's 250 pounds per cow between the sand and the manure-based herds. Just a 1% increase translates into almost $20,000 of gross income per year. So these decisions to take these quarters out does apparently have an impact on rolling herd average. It does apparently contribute to the difference in productivity that we're seeing based on using manure or a sand-based herd. All right, let's get into some of the models that we've looked at. So that's some of the characteristics overall of the data. Now I'm going to start showing you some of the modeling we did, the results of these multivariate models, where we were looking at the relationship between bedding type and some of these indicators of udder health. The first one I'm going to show you is just our overall model looking at what's the relationship between bedding type and somatic cell count. When we did all of that modeling, we found several factors that were associated with bulk tank cell count. One was year. There were differences between 2011 and 2012. There were clearly differences in bedding type. That's shown on the chart that's on your right. On that chart on your right, you'll see the vertical axis is the bulk tank somatic cell count after adjusting for our multivariate model. And you can see that the inorganic herd bulk tank somatic cell count was lower than the other two bedding types, the organic, non-manure, the mattress herds, and the manure-based. We also had other factors that stayed in that model, the type of post-dip used, the presence of a written milking routine, if they dried off the pre-dip or did not dry off the pre-dip, and some interactions. From here on out, I'm going to be talking about the factors that influence some of these measures of udder health within each bedding type, because you can clearly see that bedding type itself is associated with cell count. So when we look at ways to manage the bedding, it's got to be done specifically for each bedding type. So I'm going to start with sand bedding. So when we look at sand bedding, here's our population that was analyzed. About 80% of the herds that were in this analysis used fresh sand, and they had different types of stalls. The most common type of stall or bedding type was deep bedded fresh sand. And you can see there were 129 herds that had deep bedded fresh sand. Those herds added bedding to the stalls approximately weekly, every 6.6 days. So in a deep bedded herd, they're adding bedding about once a week. We had 13 herds which had mattresses that they put sand on top of. And those herds obviously added sand more frequently because, of course, they have less sand on the top of the mattresses. They added bedding a little more than once a week, about every 5.5 days. And then we had 14 herds that had some sort of base in their freestalls, either a tire or a sand trap. Of course, the purpose of those tires and traps are to reduce the amount of sand used, and these farms actually add sand a little less frequently. They're adding sand about every 8.4 days. So that's the characteristics of adding sand. It ranges between about 6 and 8.5 days. Not a big variation there. And when we also asked the question, in fact, I got an email from somebody yesterday asking about how frequently stalls should be dug out. Interestingly enough, and this surprised me, 71% of the farm owners, managers, told us they never dug out and replaced all the bedding in the stalls. Now, some of them would replace the back third, but 71% said they never did this. So this is an area that probably needs a little more research to find out the impact of that decision. Here's the factors that were associated with bulk tank somatic cell count for 156 herds that use sand bedding, and we had the quality data for. I'm not going to talk in depth about all of them, but there were 5 management factors that stayed in the model, the multivariate model. On the vertical axis, you can see the bulk tank somatic cell count, and the green bar indicates that farms did that practice. So, for example, you can see it says dry teats. And for the herds that dried teats, they had a significantly lower, about 160,000 bulk tank cell count, as compared to herds that did not dry teats, which was like 210, 220 or something like that. The presence of a written milking protocol stayed in our model, but it was the opposite of what you'd expect. And this happens in this type of analysis, because we can't infer causal relationships or the direction of causality. Herds that had a written milking routine had a bulk tank cell count of about 210, 220. Herds that did not were about 160. Now, this type of relationship is difficult to describe. This was highly statistically significant. And again, this is survey data. It simply could be that herds had a written milking routine because their bulk tank cell count was higher. They were working to try to reduce it, so they had consultants come in, write up a written milking routine, did some training of the milkers. We really don't know, but it definitely was included in the model. Herds that bed cows more than once a week had a higher bulk tank cell count as compared to herds that bed cows less frequently. I'm going to hold off on explaining that until the next slide because I looked at that in a little more detail. You'll see that herds that mechanically groomed versus raked, there was not statistical significance. The p-value is 0.74, but the use of the type of grooming stayed in the model because it vastly improved our model fit. And then the final factor of all the factors we looked at that stayed in our model was deep-bedded herds had slightly higher bulk tank cell counts as compared to our other types of herds, which would be those tires, traps, or the mattresses. That was barely statistically significant, and the difference was pretty small. So on a practical basis, the question that I get most frequently is, what about what's the ideal period for adding bedding to a sand-based herd? So I'm showing you the data here for the frequency of adding or replacing sand bedding just for the deep-bedded sand herds. This is, excuse me, this does not include the other types of sand bedding. And so I did this just for the deep-bedded sand herds because this is the biggest number of herds we have, so it's pretty useful to look at. This graph shows 2 measures of udder health. So we've got the measure of subclinical mastitis by looking at the bulk tank somatic cell score. So on the vertical axis on that graph on your left, that's the linear score. Remember, 4 is approximately 200,000 cells, and then 5 would be 400,000. And likewise, if you go down 1 unit to 3, you're at 100,000. And then the graph on your right is our measure of clinical mastitis, the percent of the cows that are having milk discarded because of they're in the hospital. So let's start with the somatic cell score. For both of those graphs, the horizontal axis is the frequency of adding bedding. So what you'll see first is you see that little red R squared up there. That's the equation for that trend line, that regression equation. And you can see that there's almost no variation in bulk tank somatic cell score that can be described by the frequency of adding bedding in this group of deep bedded sand herds. In fact, the thing that's really interesting to look at is within the individual days. So let's look at day 7. So that would be once a week adding of sand. And what you'll notice is that within that day, if you add sand once a week, there's way more variation in bulk tank somatic cell score. It ranges from 2.25, or approximately a little over 100,000, to 4.75, which would be approaching 400,000 on bulk tank cell score. So you can see there's an enormous amount of variation within each day. So your vertical variation is way more than the horizontal variation. So what this tells us is that other factors than just adding bedding, the frequency of adding bedding, have a bigger influence on somatic cell score than the frequency of adding bedding. There's very little relationship between those two factors. And the same thing applies for the measure of clinical mastitis. If you look at the relationship between the percent of cows with discarded milk on the vertical axis versus the frequency of adding bedding, there's a much more variation vertically within a day than there is horizontally across days. Again, telling us there's other factors which have a bigger influence. Maybe it's the organic matter content of the bedding. Maybe it's the moisture of the bedding. Maybe it's the type of sand that's being used. But definitely the bigger factor is different than the frequency of adding bedding. So for deep bedded sand herds, conclude there's no apparent advantage overall to making recommendations for adding bedding more frequently than once or twice a week. In fact, it doesn't seem to have a big influence on bulk tank cell count. There's other factors that need to be explored. So that was for sand. We also did multivariate modeling for herds that have mattresses and organic bedding. So that's primarily wood products. And in this particular model, there were only 2 management factors that stayed in the models. So this graph shows those 2 management factors. We've got the somatic cell score or count on the vertical axis and those 2 factors on the horizontal. You can see herds that had managers in the parlor on all shifts actually had a higher bulk tank somatic cell count as compared to herds that did not have managers in the parlor on all shifts, and not all shirts as it reads there, by the way. This is probably a similar factor to the written milking routine. We really can't explain the direction of causality. The other factor that remained in the model was the regular replacement of bedding in the back 1/3 of stalls. Farms that regularly replace bedding in the back 1/3 of stalls, or told us they did that on a regular basis, had a lower bulk tank cell count as compared to herds that did not. So based on that, we also looked at the data on the frequency of adding bedding for these herds with mattresses. And here's the same 2 graphs for mattress-based herds. And boy, you don't even need statistics to draw a conclusion, especially on that somatic cell score. If you look at the frequency of adding bedding from 0 to 15 days and the average somatic cell score, that chart on your left, you can see that there is absolutely no relationship. That trend line is almost absolutely straight and flat. If you look at the measure of clinical mastitis, your chart on the right, there seems to be a little bit more relationship there. You got an R-squared value of about 7%, so you've got about 7% of the variation in the percent of cows with milk discarded may be explained by the frequency of adding bedding, but it's it's actually trending down. Herds that replace bedding less frequently may have slightly less cows with clinical mastitis as measured by the milk discard. And if you're puzzling over that, there's actually some biologic basis for that. Especially for mattress-based herds or organic matter herds, that the organic matter in that bedding actually contains nutrients for bacteria. When you're frequently adding it, depending on the moisture and the organic content, you're actually continuing to supply nutrients for bacterial growth. And so if bacterial growth is measured in the laboratory on bedding that samples, typically you get really rapid growth for about 24 to 48 hours. You get a log phase of growth, then you get a stationary phase, and then you'll actually get some fall off because the nutrients are used up in the bedding. So it is possible that there's a biologic reason for this, but in general we conclude there's no apparent advantage to more frequent bedding replacement. You want to do it regularly. We do want to make sure that the bedding is dry, but simply making recommendations for the frequency of adding bedding is probably not enough. All right, finally, we did multivariate modeling for the manure-based herds, and what we found is that none of our bedding management factors stayed in those models. We couldn't really make any recommendations for the frequency of adding bedding. What we really, if you look at these graphs, actually, the manure-based bedding, the mattress-based bedding, and the inorganic, on the somatic cell score and the percent of cows with milk discarded, the manure-based herds, everything shifted up because the udder health simply isn't as good. But it's very difficult for us to make any conclusions relative to how to manage that type of bedding other than keep it as dry as possible. Okay, just a couple more things and then I'll open it up for questions. One of the things we did find in the mattress-based herds is that as the percent of cows that are three-quartered increase, the bulk mouth somatic cell count also increased. So this is an indication that, of course, subclinical and clinical mastitis are related. That's important to recognize, and it's important also to recognize that we've got to monitor both of these factors. Another thing that when we looked at the manure-based herds, we found there was a very strong association between the percentage of cows that had milk discarded and the bulk tank cell count. So again, this indicates we need to measure both. But as the bulk tank somatic cell count goes up, also the percent of cows with milk discarded goes up. Both of these things reduce productivity, and again, they're probably some of the reason we've got lower rolling herd averages on these farms. So just to conclude, so that we have some time for questions, I want to thank Rob Rowbotham. This was part of his PhD project at UW-Madison. I've got to thank 325 Wisconsin dairy farmers and their milk processors who participated in the study. We appreciate their interview time and sending the milk quality results. Grande Cheese Company sponsored Rob as a graduate student, and they also sponsored the study costs. This paper has been published. Anybody who wants it, I can send it to you, or you can get it on my website, UW Milk Quality. Just so you guys know who's out there, I know a lot of you interact with our team. These are the people who do all the work. Our grad students, Jose, Maria Jose, John Penry, Marcel, and then of course on the bottom line here are the real people who work with us. Tanya Peters, who's a technician for Paul and myself, several other people. Terry Walker, who runs my lab when Tanya's not there, and then Nikki, who many of you have interacted with, who does the website stuff. So if you have more questions, don't forget about my website. Don't forget about our YouTube channel. We'll be releasing 4 new videos in the next 4 weeks to finish our on-farm culture series, which we've been doing all this year. And with that, Paul, I'll hand it back to you, or I'll hand it to people for questions.